Hello, everybody, and welcome to the reality show brought to you by the Ayn Rand Center UK, where we apply the practical philosophy of objectivism to current events. Lately, since October 7th, we have been dealing on a daily basis with the war that is currently raging in Israel. And there has been a troubling turn of events over the last couple of days. Not so surprising to us objectivists. I think Yaron Brook famously predicted that world sentiment would start to turn against Israel. But what is sort of surprising is the wide degree of anti-Semitic sentiment we're seeing out there, that's turned into violent protests, attacks on Jewish people, and a very wide degree of support for the Gazans and the Palestinians, and a call for Israel to cease and desist in defending itself. So sympathies have certainly turned. This was not unexpected, but the high degree of anti-Semitism that seems to be saturating our culture here and in Europe seems to be surprising. There's been a few articles written about it. We're going to certainly talk about this phenomenon. What does it mean? Has it always been there? Did it ever go away at any time? What are the causes of this anti-Semitism? We have a great panel of folks here who can help us unpack this crazy phenomenon that makes me feel like the world is turned upside down. So I'm just going to throw this out there to the group, and whoever wants to be the first one to posit a thought, please do. What is going on? Or is that too big? Is that too big a question? What's causing this anti-Semitism, this virulent anti-Semitism that we're seeing out there?
I'll be happy to jump in because I think the answer is everything that ever caused it in the past, plus today's ideology, today's college students. That's where you're seeing the worst of this, or the people who've come through the college system and have swallowed modern ideology. They don't even realize, or they certainly wouldn't admit, that their education is entirely skewed by modern, meaning Kantian, Hegelian collectivism, subjectivism. They can't imagine in a million years that they are looking at reality through a lens that makes them believe that altruism, sacrifice, the underdog is the lens through which you look at history. They swallow this narrative that the Palestinians were perfectly happy in quote unquote Palestine until Britain foisted the Jews upon them. They have swallowed this narrative. They see the Jews as the oppressors, as the colonialists, as the imperialists, as the racists, and the Palestinians as the victim. And if you look at that long enough, you start thinking, you know what? No matter what Hamas does, or no matter what Hezbollah does, it's justified after 75 years of the strong. Again, because of altruism, they equate efficacy and strength with the idea of taking advantage. They can't see it any other way. This is what they think. This is why they get indignant. This is why they will walk around and tear down posters of kidnapped victims as if the victims are now the perpetrators, because they are symbols of the strong, symbols of the oppressors. This is what's taught in the colleges.
I think America has a strong tradition of loving the underdog. Rocky was an underdog, but it was always the underdog who beat the odds because of an incredible heroic characteristics. Now the underdog is almost worshipped or given a moral stature based on the fact that they're the underdog, irrespective of their values. Now, Robert, you said they're being taught this curriculum in college, and you talked about an ideology, but you were not specific with respect to the ideology. Amy, do you know anything about this ideology? Can you expand a little bit about this ideology?
I used to call myself a communist when I was 15. And yes, so yeah, I see these kids, and I think of I see these protesters and these unfortunate, young women tearing down posters of children who are held hostage. And I think to myself, I can kind of remember thinking all sorts of interesting things when I was 15, and how I felt growing up poor myself, with a single mom, and not feeling like I had a family to support or to help me figure out the world. And not to say I'm not to say that we need to project these specifics onto these nasty protesters that we see today, but I can understand that enticement, that siren call of Marxism and communism, and you know, supporting the greater good. You have to break break eggs to make an omelet, and all of this. And I think also in years past, you think of Occupy Wall Street, and I'm specifically thinking of the Day of Rage, if you remember that. Day of Rage, where all the kids went out and protested whatever they protested. Wall Street, capitalism, promoted socialism and Marxism, and I think in a lot of ways, thinking back to my own thinking when I was a teenager, it was very, very floating, a lot of floating abstractions. I didn't know any Jewish people. All I knew was that my grandfather was Jewish. I didn't actually equate Jewish people with the evil others at the time, but I definitely hated the idea of Wall Street and capitalism and people making money, people lending money, not actually producing anything, yada, yada, yada. And it wasn't until I read The Fountainhead and I saw Howard Rourke do what he did, not compromised on what he wanted to do in life, and actually decided to go to, what do you call it? The not the mines, but the quarry. And he'd rather work there than, not do what he wanted to do. I didn't really understand the world until I read The Fountainhead, and I didn't understand how much power I had in determining my own life. I think, and I think for these really young people in these protests, I think of that, and I'm a little bit hopeful that that they're not actually going to, especially the non-Muslims in America, they're not going to actively go out and hurt Jewish people, although I'm not entirely sure.
Well, they are at the age of intense idealism, but the idealism that they're given, I want to throw this at John, has linked Western civilization to colonialism, and colonialism to abuse and exploitation of people of color. And so they're all synonymous now. It's all sort of a mental goo that sticks in the minds of these young people that they have to fight against. And their idealism is that all of that represents something completely evil, and that any act to end that is justifiable, which gives me less confidence, Amy, that they're going to be nonviolent. I think they think violence now is actually a legitimate protest. So, John, what do you say about this? I mean, there's a constant refrain that the Israelis, the Jews in Israel are colonialists, occupiers. Of course, I say that's absolutely false for a number of reasons, but I want to sort of probe you, not like an alien, but probe you your depth of knowledge with respect to whether or not the Jews are a colonial power or something else.
No, I don't think they are a colonial power. At worst, Israel or Zionism is more of a nationalism, but they have more of a right to that nationalism than any other group on the planet, in my opinion. The New Left operates completely on the idea of the oppressor and the oppressed. And if you're stronger and successful, you must be an oppressor, because according to their ideology, achievement and virtue and things are just luck, and you're just exploiting that luck against other people. I have to say, I listened to Yarn Brooks talk about the roots of anti-Semitism. It was actually in two parts. And the first part was more focused on the modern left, and the second part was kind of the history of it. And I highly, highly recommend listening to that. It is extremely enlightening, both philosophically and historically. So I just want to briefly sum up what he said for people that might not make it to listen to both of those talks. But basically, this fight, this resentment towards Jews is as old as Christianity itself. The Christians, ultimately, the first start of it was when they blamed the Jews for killing Jesus. And from there were born all kinds of conspiracy theories about the horrible things that Jews would do to Christians and Christian babies. And all these stories were spread around. And then on top of that, you had the idea that Christianity was more of a universal religion that anyone could kind of join, whereas Jews, it was a bit more exclusive. You had to go through more things to become a Jew. And then they also resisted assimilation in a way. They wanted to stay in their smaller groups, small towns, and not necessarily be part of Christian life in the sense that the pagans and the other religions were starting to convert. So, and then on top of that, everything about their religion was different. They were the other. They dressed differently, they act differently, they talk differently from the growing culture of Christianity. And so then this mystical thinking and this racism and tribalism just kept feeding this hatred of the Jews. And then on top of that, the Jews were not allowed to do a lot of, become involved in a lot of professions or even own land in a lot of areas back then. So they became the money lenders and the traders and started to become tied to that whole kind of businessman type lifestyle. And right from there, the start, where they started to lend money, they took interest, and the Christians considered this to be exploitation, and you should be altruistically just giving your money to other people to help them. You should expect nothing in return. And the Jews were just greedy and profit-seeking. And it festered and festered this way for many years until Marx came along and just fundamentally tied the Jews to capitalism. He called them selfish and greedy, and they are the problem. And from that birthed the new modern left, and even the libertarians, who are somewhat agree with the exploitation theory of life. And so this brings in the envy. Marx brings in the envy. So you have this tribalism, this collectivism, this racism, and now envy and hatred of success, because the Jews were disproportionately successful to other races. And people saw this as, well, they must be exploiting people, because how else do you get ahead in life and succeed and achieve other than stepping on other people? And so it's like a complete perfect storm of mysticism, tribalism, altruism, racism, collectivism, egalitarianism, and finally envy and hatred of the good for being the good. And it's just such a complicated mess. And some people adopt certain ideas as their foundation for hating the Jews more than others. The left has the egalitarianism, but then the libertarians are anti-statist. So they hate the Jews because they made a state, and they're a successful state. And that fits in the libertarians' fate, anarchist libertarians, I should say, that are completely anti-state. And then you've got the Christians that are adopting more Marxist ideas, or I should say the new right, Marxist ideas, along with their, fundamental Christian ideas and their penchant for conspiracy theories. And it's just, all this stuff comes together. And when you look at it all that way, it sort of makes more sense, even though it's the most bizarre scapegoating in all of history, and that has
So, so,
continued
you,
for
so,
thousands of years.
so you're saying that the Jews seem to be a lightning rod, a point of focus for a whole lot of anti-Western, anti-capitalist, popular conspiracy theories going on
Yep.
right now. Gil, what is all this nonsense about colonialism and occupier? I constantly hear that the Israelis are an occupying force. It simply does not strike me as that. But can you clear this up? Why do people say this, and why is it not so?
I think even before you speak on kind of the history and what got Israel the land that it holds today, it's unclear to me how people look at Israel and imagine that this is a nationalistic country that is obsessed about ruining the lives of Palestinians and taking whatever they can from them. Like, it's so clear that this is not the situation. 20% of the citizens of Israel are Arabs. Most of them define themselves as Palestinians, at least in some respect. They speak Arabic, many of them are Muslim, and 20% of them are Israel citizens. So how could you imagine that Israel is like this crazy Jewish mystical nation that is trying to take over? That's the one aspect in the modern scenario. The other aspect is, okay, yes, it's a conflict that has lasted for between 50 and 75 years, depending where you start counting. Because the Gaza Strip, for example, I want to remind all of you, we took over it only in 1967, so that's 56 years ago. So it's a bit younger in the responsibility of Israel than other Arabs.
Yes, people don't realize that the Gaza Strip and the West Bank were occupied by Egypt and Jordan, respectively, for 19 years. The Jews had no governing responsibility in those areas, and neither Jordan nor Egypt did anything about the refugee problem during that time. And then you can say 56 years, but I mean, I get the sense that Israel has stepped away, especially from Gaza, since 2005, and has more or less stepped away from the West Bank. Those are essentially quasi-states that could become legitimate states should they choose. Am I wrong? Am I just projecting something?
You're not wrong at all. The point that actually I wanted to make is that people tell themselves, especially the ones that call Zionism like this crazy anti-life, I don't know, ideology or something like that. They tell themselves the story that Israel is doing a genocide in Gaza. Why? Like, Israel could do a genocide so many times before. We had the power. The only thing that we did not have and still do not have today is the motive. We're not looking to kill people for the sake of people. Everything that we have done shows it. Everything that we do, even now in this war, shows it. Every week they throw many tens of thousands notes in Arabic to Gaza telling people, go away, we're not, go south, evacuate, we're only looking for Hamas, we're not trying to hurt civilians. So how could people tell themselves the story that Israel is doing a genocide? I do not know.
Well, more than that, how can they say they're committing a genocide when the population has grown several times? Usually a genocide means the extermination of a population, right? Not the growth of a population.
So it grew a lot, and because we mentioned that Israel took over both the Western Bank and Gaza and the Gaza Strip in 1967, the condition of the people living there improved. Like, it's not that we took over and before, when they were other Egypt and Jordan, they had a wonderful life, and then we came and, oh no, it's horrible. It's not. We took over in a war that was started by Egypt and Jordan, and the lives of the residents of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank improved. So again, people around the world, they do not let the facts confuse them. They know that Israel is the bad side. They know that Israel is doing a genocide, and they just don't care.
It's astounding, Robert, that people seem to forget that the Jordanians murdered Palestinians by the tens of thousands for fear of Yasser Arafat setting up his own terrorist state within Jordan itself. They have murdered more Palestinians than I think all of the combined wars that Israel has had with Palestinian adjacent, with Arabs, period, with Palestinians involved. Nobody seems to mention that. Nobody seems to call that a genocide.
No, and you're absolutely right. It's even worse than the Egyptians. The Lebanese don't want these people. The Egyptians don't want the Gazans to come over. They have walls and borders where they don't allow them. Same thing with Lebanon. They're not going to let people from the West Bank come up. It's worse than they don't want them. They do want them. They want them to stay right where they are. These people are pawns. They are essentially armaments. We use the term human shield until it doesn't mean anything anymore, but that's exactly what's going on. They are chess pieces. Their neighbors couldn't care less about their health or their safety or their well-being. Obviously, the leaders, Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah on the West Bank, also could not possibly care less about these people. All they care about is the role that they play in this holy war, and that is it. And again, our kids think that's okay. We see videos now. We've seen videos of all the atrocities, even though we've got people denying them. Oh, Israel is making some of these stories up. We have videos of people in Gaza, people in Hamas bragging about the slaughter, about the killing. And our kids ignore that because, again, the narrative is more important. The fight for justice is more important. I say kids, but these are young adults we're talking about. At some point, each and every one of us, each of us personally, we take what we grew up with and then we make a decision. Am I going to accept all of that, or am I going to think for myself? These kids have crossed the line. You could say some of them are victims of their teaching, and they absolutely are, but they are of an age where at some point you take responsibility, you go from being the victim to being the perpetrator. The ugliest version of that, speaking of videos shared in Gaza, are the kids. The kids, the Palestinians, if you want to use that word. I call them Gazans so as not to equate them with having some kind of ownership right to this land. These Gazan children, 6 years old, 7 years old, and their parents are so proud to put up videos of them saying, I'm going to grow up and I'm going to kill Israelis. At that age, are they victims or are they perpetrators? Are they morally innocent? Arguably, yes. Far less excuse for our college students who are far past the age of saying, I need to think for myself. I need to actually look at the history. And the kids, for Christ's sake, have the internet. It's not that hard to find out what the real history of the Middle East is. They have crossed that line. Ayn Rand said, the men who are not interested in philosophy need it most urgently. They are the most helplessly in its power. These kids are helplessly within the power of the ideology they're being taught in school. Again, this ideology not just of altruism, but of imperialism, colonialism, racism, the idea that those are the essentials of history. So small wonder that they say the things they do, they believe the things that they do, and why our enemy goes far beyond the borders of Israel.
And Robert, what do you think? How much do you think the concept of empathy as a moral sentiment, as sort of the primary moral sentiment, if you listen to people like Sam Harris and people out there, have to do with the focus on the Palestinians as the victim, as opposed to a rationally self-interested ethics?
It's a great question, and I really want to emphasize the answer. And the answer is that empathy is the amplifier. It's the value aspect. It's not determinative. You can't listen to somebody like Sam Harris. If you haven't heard his latest podcast, outstanding. You cannot listen to that and not have empathy for the Israelis. Likewise, our students can't hear the narrative of the Palestinians as victims and not have empathy for all of those innocent Palestinians. I don't mean Hamas and Hezbollah, but, the victims. So you're right. Empathy matters. It's what raises the temperature of this conversation. But who the adults, who are political leaders, have empathy for is entirely dependent on the ideas that they've accepted.
Hey,
So
Amy,
it matters, but it's an amplifier.
Amy, haven't you noticed that, I remember Peikoff saying pictures are not an argument. And I remember him refusing to go to an abortion debate if the person was going to bring pictures. And yet, in this most complex battle that we've experienced in decades, pictures seem to be the arguments for the people on the pro-Palestinian side. They seem to speak everything. As opposed to, and so it makes them blank out the fact that one side deliberately kills innocent people and cynically uses them for political gain. The other side is forced into the tragic moral situation of having to kill innocents in order to get to the bad guys. There's an extreme psychological difference between those two things, and you can't seem to get people to get off the picture of the traumatized child to see the Israeli soldier who's traumatized having to do that because he's been forced to.
Yes. First, I want to say I totally agree about empathy with what Robert was saying, and that it is very much akin to moral indignation. It is an amplifier. It's So, but in terms of
it's not a standard. When you say amplifier, I want to ask you both. It's not a standard, but it's something. It's something that amplifies your sense of indignancy over something that's happened.
Right.
Yes.
It's not the evidence, it is the motivation. And we don't sunder fact and values, so I have no problem with that distinction. Yes,
it's a value marker. It's basically saying this is important. Listen, pay attention. And empathy is not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's great to use in rational circumstances. So is moral.
If your values are set, if your values are appropriate, if your values are rational, then empathy is appropriate. But feeling empathy for people who are murderers, that's insanity.
That is self-destructive. Yes. Feeling sorry for the abuser of a domestic abuse, a husband who's been battering his wife for years and putting her into the hospital. No, you don't feel sorry or have empathy for him, even if but anyway, so I always go back to what the context of what people know psychologically in terms of the criminal justice system and what people understand to be right and wrong in America. And I refer, if you've noticed, I always refer back to that, into that context. And that's when I ask people, how can you not be empathetic, of course, against, for Israelis, but how can you also not be empathetic for those children and the women of these Palestinians who are in this cult, this Islamic cult, who has been raised to believe that their life is not their own. Women are not, it's not appropriate for them to learn how to read. It's not appropriate for them to even sit at the same table as the men after they serve them food. All this stuff, there's so many cultural things that are completely ignored.
Well, that's a very interesting question. Should I feel empathy for that? Because it's super hard for me to, based on the way they act. Now, it may be that it's because of all of this ignorance. It may be it's because of these cultural influences that they can't get out from under. But I have very little sympathy for it because they act on it.
Absolutely. And that's why it's what Robert was kind of alluding to before, was that there is a crossover eventually from a victim to becoming a perpetrator. And that is definitely to be taken into consideration. A lot of these people in these Islamic cults who are over in the Middle East are perpetrators. Yes, they were brought into this and brainwashed as children, but eventually, when they reach the age of 15, they should know better, but they choose not to. And but going back to the picture as an argument, of course, yes. Yaron Brook was talking about the TikTok views and the kind of discrepancy between anti-Israel and anti-Hamas or anti-Semitic and anti-Hamas videos that are much, much greater is the anti-Israeli pro-Hamas videos are much more viewed. So I mean, I'll just say this. I think it's extremely important, again, to use empathy and moral indignation and moral certainty in talking about what we're talking about. This is not dry. This is life and death. This is pain. This is the pain pleasure mechanism here at the very root of this. And to see human beings in this situation, in this war. And that's one of the things that I think most young people don't understand what war is. War is you've got the side who is good, the side who is bad, and the side who is good needs to completely obliterate the other side if the war is going to end. Because the bad guys are always going to want war. The bad guys are always going to want to hit back. So yeah, it's very difficult, but you just keep having to. I keep posting on Facebook and keep posting and letting people know that the Jewish people are human and that they cannot be and should never be dehumanized. And Palestinians are human too, and they have moral agency, and they should be held accountable for their actions. And they have a choice. They have a choice. They could have a long time ago, of course, not voted in Hamas to be their government, but they could have risen up against them. They could have risen up and said, I don't want to be a human shield. I'm going to do whatever I can and fight Hamas and get the heck out of here, no matter what.
Well, they're trying to do that in Iran. So, and Iran and the mullahs certainly have a great deal more political power and a capacity to injure the people who rise up there. And yet it's happening. So you're right. They have enough they could have had enough agency to at least make a show of force against Hamas. And since they haven't, I'm inclined to believe that Hamas is popular and that the philosophy of Hamas more or less saturates that culture, in which case the innocents are extremely difficult to pick out, and you can't spend your time really parsing out who's who.
I would say most people there are not innocent. They know they're not stupid. They know what's been going on. They know what Hamas is about. They should have left a long time ago. If America was taken over by an authoritarian dictator who was bent on genocide against the Canadians or whatever it is, I would get the hell out of here. I wouldn't want to be a part of that.
I wonder if there would be enough popular will to fight that today after COVID. I seriously doubt that rugged individualism that used to animate the vast majority of Americans is still there. It feels like it's disappearing. You're skeptical.
I'll tell you what didn't disappear was the New York Post. In the one articles that was discussed that we were going to discuss today, the New York Post actually has a picture on the front page of two young women tearing down the posters of Israeli hostages, and the looks on their faces are quite telling. They know what they're doing. They know they're doing wrong.
Oh, they look arrogant. They look arrogant. I've seen those pictures.
They do, but they don't want to admit it. But yeah. So, but I mean, I'm glad to see that the New York Post had that image out there. It's important.
And I'm glad to see that on some news networks they are calling out some of these people, and there is some pushback. I don't know how long that's going to last. I hope it lasts. I want to get to Gil again. It seems like uh, Israel is not yet bowing to international pressure. They still are pursuing an offensive into Gaza City, despite so much pressure to pause and let humanitarian aid sort of. They've already let humanitarian aid in, but to the extent that they should pause hostilities entirely, they seem to be sticking to their guns with respect to not stopping until the hostages are returned. Do you think that's going to remain that way, Gil?
Yes and no. Yes, Israel is obsessed about getting the hostages back, and I do not think it's a good thing, because the only way to get the hostages back safely is to fold to Hamas, is to negotiate with them, is to give them what they want, is to make them able to portray themselves to the world and to themselves and to the population in Gaza as the winners. And I am afraid that it might happen, that Israel will make a deal, will cut a deal with them. And I think this is exactly the kind of thing that got us into this entire mess, including the hate that many across the world feel towards Israel.
So what should Israel do?
Israel should, as Amy just said, what is a war? A war is where the good side goes against the bad side with everything that it has, with the intention to obliterate it. And this is exactly the thing that we have never done as a nation. We never tried to really eliminate those who are threatening us. And because of that, we got ourselves into a situation where we've been in control of both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank for over 50 years. And the world is looking, and the world is confused about it, because, like, what's happening? Why is it so middle of the roadness? Who is the bad side? Who is the good side? It almost in some way becomes unclear if 50 years has passed and Israel lets those people stand there and say that they claim and claim the things that they claim. So what I'm saying to your question is that, yeah, Israel is still hitting hard on Hamas, but all over Israel, you drive across Israel and there's those signs about bring back the hostages safe and sound. And the only way to do that is to negotiate with terrorists. So in a sense, this is what many in Israel are asking for.
John, how do you think this ends?
Not well for Israel, because I think, like Gilad said, they are going to compromise with them to get the hostages out. And so all that will be left is Hamas will remain, and more of the world hates Israel. Especially the more people they take out in Gaza without actually, if they take out a lot of people but don't take out Hamas, it's going to be a disaster for Israel.
I don't see any other way of taking out Hamas without taking out a lot of people, unfortunately.
Right. But I'm just saying, if they're going to take out a lot of people and eventually they're going to be pushed to negotiate with them if they still think there are hostages there. And so you'll have this a double negative of Hamas still existing and all those people being killed for what? Just to hurt Hamas a little bit. And then now they're going to exist, and Iran will get stronger, and Lebanon, and the cancer will just metastasize.
Robert, do you agree? Do you think this ends badly?
No, I'm still hopeful. I think that Israel is doing the right things too slowly, a little too apologetically, but they are doing the right things. If I could take a minute and shout out our super chatters, because folks have been great in the chat. Just real quick, Daniel, thank you right away with a $10 contribution. Very generous. Jonathan Honig in with $10 as well. And again in with $2. Jonathan is, of course, one of our best hosts, but also one of our great supporters. Kiana Pellegrino, somebody you might know, is in with $2. Ashley Shrugged with $4.99 says, jealousy much? Like the hatred in the U.S. of the 1%, Israel and the Jewish people are largely successful, relatively wealthy people, thus they are the enemy. Just so. Ryan Murphy's in with $2. Ashley Shrugged with $1.99. Thank you very much for that. And Philosophical Zombie Hunter, who I haven't seen in the chat in a while, it's good to see him in there, with £5 says, why is it that whenever terrorists attack Israel, the left thinks that that's something that happened, or excuse me, the left thinks that something that happened 70 years ago justifies it? Yeah, how far back in history do we have to go? The point has been made by, I think Yaron Brook made the point, Sam Harrison made the point. You can go back in history 70 years ago and say, oh yeah, it's the UK and Israel's fault. You can go back in history 120 years ago and say, no, it's all Palestine's fault. You can go back 400, you can go back wherever you want in history to decide whose property that is, or you can just say, here are the people who are here right now, using things in a civilized way, running a rational government. But it's a great question from Philosophical Zombie Hunter. Why is it that whenever terrorists attack Israel, Is that in the Times? Is that something we read in the newspapers? Oh, wait, that's what happens 99% of the time. And that 1% is when it gets so bad that Israel finally defends itself. So thank you to the super chatters there. And again, I am hopeful. I am seeing Israel's actions as, it's very easy to say too little, too late, or too slow. And I would agree with all three of those, but they are taking the right actions. And I'm hopeful that they will show the resolve necessary. Will they do everything that I would recommend? No. Will they do everything Yaron Brook would recommend? No. Will they do enough that this will not just be another beat back, which will come back to haunt us in 5 or 10 years? I don't know, but I do still have some hope for that. I like much of what they're doing.
Amy, do you agree? I'm
hopeful as well. Not just say I agree with everything that Robert said, but I think I'll just add to it that they have at least expressed their intention to take over the entire area of Gaza, and I'm hoping that means basically making sure that if there are, children left in the area, I'm sure there will be, because their parents sure as heck don't, they do want them there to be a casualty. But if there are, I hope that they are taken over into better families and actually educated and like deprogrammed, and not subject to any more brainwashing in Gaza. I think it's extremely important.
Just real quick,
ahead, Robert.
On that note, just real quick, because Ashley Shrugged not only super chatted, she did have a comment. She said, colleges no longer encourage independent thought. Well, Amy, I hope that nobody encourages independent thought over in Gaza, but hopefully people are still able to see reality enough to realize that. I just had to throw that in. Also, as I was talking about, you could go back anywhere in history. Our producer, Daniel, is in the chat and says, no, it's the Romans. Yeah, you could go back wherever you like, place the blame where you like, or you can look at reality. Sorry.
Yeah, what have the Romans ever done for us?
Yeah.
There's the aqueducts, the roads.
I was thinking about that same thing about the Romans, because I read somewhere in passing that the Romans called it Palestina to punish the Jews for one of their revolts early in around the year 100 or 200 or something like that.
So that's right. It was the Roman pronunciation for Philistine, who
right.
were the enemies of the Jews at the time.
So it was like a punishment. So really the Romans really did all start this whole thing. Well, and if you've read any of James Vallant's book about creating Christ, it just fits so well. The whole thing about, the Romans creating Christianity to quell the Jews. after all this time, look at how it's worked out. You know,
So I have a
everyone
question. Yeah, I have a question for Gil, and but I'll first say that I know more. I'm seeing a lot of more of my Jewish friends on Facebook. Basically learning how to use guns and buying guns as they should. I know Yaron Brook has a different opinion about guns, but so I don't know, Gil, do you know anything in particular about have they decided to unlock? I believe that they had a law that you had to lock up all of your ammunition, your guns in the kibbutz. And has that changed? Do you know?
So the two separate issues. One issue is the whole issue of the right to carry arms in Israel. There is no right like that. I do not have a weapons, personal gun permit or whatever it's called. And maybe now I could get one. I filed the papers. Let's see if now they're gonna give me a permit because of, the paradigm shift. That's one issue. Another issue that you kind of mentioned, and people do talk about it, is the fact that all those towns that got attacked around the Gaza Strip, they had like semi-military personnel, like just residents who were part of the squad who is supposed to respond. And there were issues that some of the weapons that they should have had were taken away because the IDF was worried about weapons getting stolen by Arabs in the area and stuff like that. So many of the squads in the towns that were attacked, they did not have enough weapons. So now there is no towns with people next to the Gaza Strip or next to Lebanon, because all the towns also in Gaza, next to the Gaza Strip, but also next to Lebanon, got evacuated because of the risk for an attack. So there is no such situation anymore. But if there will be, I'm sure that those squads are going to have all the guns that they want. Like, that mistake is not going to happen again.
So I want to throw the same question at you. Do you think this ends well for you guys?
I told you guys, I'm very worried about the hostages situation. Like, I just came back from Tel Aviv. I met a friend who came back from reserve service to spend some time with his family. And again, remember how close this was to everyone. Like, one of my best friends, he works in a high-tech company, just had a baby. She's 10 months old, and bam, he's away for a month in the army. He's a lawyer. He doesn't do army stuff. He's like, in suits all day long, and suddenly for a month he's away from his family. So I went to visit them, and we are in the main square in Tel Aviv, and the square is filled with 240 different beds with books on them, and slippers and shoes and eyeglasses, and all the beds that represent kids that are hostages are like tiny and cute, and the beds that represent elderly citizens, they have like how do you call those things?
Walkers,
walkers next to them, and it touches you deeply, and it touches you with the message that we have to get them back, i.e., we need to make a deal with Hamas. And I don't hear anybody talking against it clearly. And as long as that's the sentiment, it means that at some point we're going to compromise. Because when Hamas is going to understand that compromise, because before Hamas is going to get to a very deadly point, they're going to start executing hostages. Can Israel take that? Right now, the mentality doesn't suggest that it can. So I'm not optimistic so much. I feel that there's a good chance that we're going to fold way too early.
I hate to conclude on not an optimistic note, but I share your sentiment. I don't think Israel will have the will to do what it needs to do to completely eliminate Hamas. I think you're right. The hostage situation and the desire to bring them back and to compromise to bring them back will be too strong in the end, and we will remain with some unfortunate sort of occupation of Gaza, with Hamas still somehow in power as a rebel force, and I think their stature in the world has notably grown over the last few years, and this can only grow it a little bit further, unfortunately. So that is my take on things. Had they listened to Euron and struck very quickly, immediately, while world sentiment was on their side, things might have been very different. But I find that objectivists are sort of the Cassandra of world politics. We've predicted pretty much everything that has ever come to pass, and nobody believes us.
It's because we're successful at doing it, so that means we must be exploiting some knowledge or something, right?
Whatever it is, it sucks, and hopefully there'll come a time when it will change. Upcoming shows, folks, at 7 p.m. UK time, a new video with Harry Binswanger on "Is Israel an Apartheid State?" And the link is in the chat. I think it's very important for people to see, because one of the main critiques you will hear from these scumbag pro-Palestinian bots and otherwise misinformed people is that Israel is an apartheid state. It sort of comes out of their mouth without thoughts behind it. They're words that their mouth is able to manufacture and push out into the world, but they have no meaning. And you'll discover why if you watch Harry Binswanger. Well, folks, I think that's it for the day. Unless there are any parting comments anybody would like to make before we bid our audience adieu. This has been go ahead.
About the hostages, that I think the policy should be to attack Hamas as if there are no hostages, but to attack them even harder because there are hostages. Absolutely.
I agree with you 100%. I think Iran said something like that early on. You have to assume the hostages are dead and proceed accordingly. And any hostages you get back is a blessing, of course, but they cannot be used anymore to manipulate innocents in defending their lives. And how cynical that the world thinks on some degree, on some level, that that's okay. Well, folks, tomorrow we'll be wrestling with this issue again from an objectivist point of view, which I think is unique in the world. So it's important that if you like this content, like it, subscribe it, spread it around. People need to hear this stuff, because it's not what the conservatives are saying. It's not what the left is saying. That's not even what the quote unquote liberals are saying, or the libertarians. We have a unique point of view, and I think it's the correct one. So tune in and check it out, folks. And always remember to check your premises. We'll see you later.